Good evening. How could you end the evening with an artist after the scholars and mayor and the director of the university? I have to say I'm really very honored to be here tonight to open the conference. And I want to say that I'm also humbled to be surrounded by experts, art historians, scholars. And I'm here to speak as an artist, to share with you the development of my work. I am not an expert or an art historian, so please keep that in mind. However, I would like to take a few moments before I take you on this visual journey of my work to share with you some of my own perspective of what are the challenges that the artists born in Muslim countries face today, working internationally. And as you know, there is first questions I would like to ask. How do we define contemporary Islamic art today? Is it possible to generalize and package all artists that are born in Islamic countries into one? Like, would it be possible to package and generalize all artists born in Western countries as Christian artists? Is it possible to approach an understanding of Is it possible to approach an understanding of different Islamic cultures without understanding their political history, the current political system, and the place and relation of Islam with historically, whether in fact they are an authentic religion in the country or is brought by invasion, whether it's a secular Islam or non-secular Islam. And whether the artists who are living in contemporary artists in the Islamic world are dealing only with traditional barriers or in fact cultural taboos, or in fact they're dealing with sanctions imposed by the government, meaning censorship or absence of freedom of expression. So is it possible for us to speak on the same terms about Iranian artists who are living and working in Iran as it is to speak about Turkish artists, Moroccan artists, Saudi Arabian artists? This is nearly impossible. Now, my next question would be, is the Western culture somewhat guilty of overgeneralizing and vastly stereotyping and expanding and perpetuating the negative, just so many of you. I'm going back. I want you to know that I'm just an artist. But I'm going back to the Western culture in the way that it perpetuates the negative image or exoticizes the image of the Muslim identity in a way that it refuses to see that artists belonging to different cultures have ownership of specific cultural backgrounds. And therefore, today, as Islamic artists, I would say being a contemporary Muslim artist is a mixed blessing. On the one hand, you have the world's attention as Islamic subjects and cultures are perpetually topical and fascinating. But at the same time, we are defying, confronting, resisting stereotypes and cliches that are made about our cultures. And yet, some of us, inside of our homes or in exile, we're also dealing with our own traditional societies, but also oppressive societies that create such boundaries and suffocating pressure for us to produce work and sometimes to even work with the absence of freedom of expressions, etc. So ultimately, I think for contemporary Muslim artists today, all they want to do is make art. But in reality, they have two battles to fight, one inside of their country and one on the outside. Now, let me take you back to what it's like to be an Iranian artist. As most of you know, Iran has had a major cultural and political transformation after the Islamic Revolution. We were once Persia, and now we're Islamic Republic of Iran. We were once a secular Muslim country, and now we are a dictatorship, a non-secular society. We were a country that once religion was a choice, a personal, philosophical, spiritual, mystical practice. Now we have a country that has brought a revolution that has made political Islam and ideological Islam. If we were once known with our mystics and poets and philosophers and scientists and artisans and architects, now we are known by our mullahs and by the fanatics, people who make nuclear wars and bombs and their revolutions and atrocities and oppression. This has caused a deep identity crisis for Iranian people. We are conflicted by our Persian and Islamic identity. I believe every Iranian today embodies that identity crisis, that kind of conflict. In fact, many Iranian people left Iran after the Islamic Revolution because they were not comfortable with this way of Islamization. This was not the spirit of the Iranian people, the way that Islam was brought through the Islamic Revolution. My work, in many ways, embodies that form of dichotomy, that kind of identity crisis, the Persian versus the Islamic. My work, in one hand, has a footing on emotional, poetic, mystical, philosophical issues that are rooted in pre-Islamic literature, tradition, and yet my work is perpetually dealing with the current socio-political realities of Iran. My work also borrows from the ideas of classic Islamic art, the principles of classic Islamic art, the absence of portraiture, the way that abstraction, repetition, symmetry, harmony, the integration of text and image, the use of decorative motif, the emphasis on idea of beauty, which is, I believe, the principle, for most of you know better than me, the principle of idea of classic Islamic art. Somehow it's all embodied in my work, and it has taken me years to realize that as an artist. So I would say artists like me are the embodiment or the readaptation of classic Islamic art with a contemporary political twist. I would like to also, before I go to review some of my work, to say that my work has changed a lot from photography to video to filmmaking. But there's a few things that have been perpetually there. One is the question of personal. Unlike what most people think, I'm not the ambassador of Iranian people, Iranian artists, women of Islam. My work has developed based on my own personal desire and need to cope with my distance from the country, since I have been absent from my country ever since I was 17 years old, before the Islamic Revolution. And since then, my work has been a way to reconnect, to create a dialogue with my own lost country, and in many ways to keep that relationship alive. So my work is fiction. It's not documentary. My work is created from the perspective of an artist living abroad. But my work is personal but not autobiographical. It's also political. Why political? Because I don't believe there is a single living contemporary Iranian artist who can claim that their work is not political. Politics has defined our lives, the past, the present, and the future. I have lived most of my life outside of Iran due to the Islamic Revolution. I have been, since 17 years old, distant from my family and my home. So you can understand the urgency of the political issue is not a choice. It's a reality of people like myself who don't find politics as a way that is escapable. Poetry. I believe if most of you know Iranian people, poetic language, metaphoric language, allegory is the way that they best can express their political and emotional senses. I don't believe that is a surprise for a country that has been ruled over and over again by dictatorship. Poetic language has been the most subversive and most free way to be able to say everything that is not allowed to be told. And naturally, I have intuitively embraced the language of poetry. The question of paradoxical, if you look at my work, like the work that you have just seen, everything I do, and I'm being the art historian here, it's about the notion of opposites. It's about masculine, feminine, culture, nature, private, public, mystical, violent, political, spiritual, beautiful, and disturbing. And no wonder my work are black and white, magic and realism. I am never able to see anything in one way. Everything is always divided into two, both visually and conceptually. Finally, before I go into, and please excuse me for being nervous, remember, I'm just an artist. I am more comfortable now. The nomadic part of my work, the fact that I jumped from photography to video to cinema, it's really a reflection of my own personality. I am a nomad. I am a traveler. I have never been any place for very long. I don't even know what it's like to be in a place that I speak the same language, that I listen to the same music, or I look like everyone else. So I have been truly a nomad. And for me, it's a way of life, a way of starting all over again, to be a beginner constantly, to reinvent myself. So through this past 15 years that I've been an artist, I have somehow jumped from one medium to another. Now let's go through some of my work. I have just come to realize that so far, my relationship to photography, as I said, is black and white with no landscape in the background. It's highly posed, it's very minimal, and it's work that I do in my studio, and I use my hand with the calligraphy. So it's a very solitary experience. But also I found that the two body of work that I have created thus far, Woman of Allah, and the recent work, the Book of Kings, are both about covering history. Woman of Allah is a series of portraits that really speaks about the Islamic Revolution. And this is when I first went back to Iran after having been absent for 12 years. In many ways, this series of photographs try, from the perspective of an artist who has lived abroad for many years, to go back and to comprehend the transformation of Iranian society from Persia to Islamic Republic of Iran. And since the subject was so vast, I decided to focus on the concept of martyrdom that at the time during the revolution was so popular and almost institutionalized. For me, as an artist living abroad, as someone whose generation brought the Islamic Revolution, was not directly involved with the revolution, it was a profound curiosity, this intersection of love of God, faith, devotion, yet cruelty, death, and violence. This group of photographs basically become my interpretation, my way of understanding, framing my questions as an artist who has been outside to comprehend the principal ideas behind the Islamic Revolution. The main components of this series was the female body, which is very, very controversial, the text, which is written poetry by Iranian women poets, the veil, which is absolutely the most controversial symbol when it comes to an understanding of Islamic cultures, particularly in relation to women, and the weapon that clearly suggested the violence that was relating to the Islamic Revolution. This point, I was actually posing for the photographs myself. It really started like a play. And this was after having abandoned art for about 10 years. So this group of photographs are my first entry into the art world. The next group of photographs I would like to show is how, if Woman of Allah sort of captured the essence of a historical moment in Iranian history in 1979, which was the Islamic Revolution. 2009, we saw the Green Movement, we saw the Arab Spring. To me, there was another major transformation in the Iranian society. If in the past, in the Islamic revolution, we saw women that were submissive, that were religious, that were so, that they didn't have a particular identity of their own. In generation that is current in 2009, you have young Iranians who are highly educated, that are not submissive, and they're very combative and defiant. This group of photographs were also trying to pay tribute to the spirit of activism, to the spirit of the people of Iran who poured into the streets of Tehran in the summer of 2009 to confront the Iranian government after the fraud of the election. But also that this series connected to the Arab Spring, as I'd been very much present in the Middle East, in Egypt, and I was able for the first time to witness a revolution transpire in Egypt, in Tahrir Square. So if these faces, to me, also represent an idea of conviction of those who are committed to their country, to their nation, yet this idea that, again, this devotion, this love, and this sacrifice is always interfaced with atrocity, violence, and death. So I went after, like women of Allah, with absolute minimal body gestures. The hand on heart is obviously the pledge of honor, is a universal symbol of love of nation. So this group of work that were called patriots, to me, they became the soldiers of the revolutions, the activists. Then there was about 45 images of people who were the witness to the revolution. These writings were poetry by Iranian contemporary poets, but for the first time I decided also to revisit the Book of Kings of Ferdowsi, which most of you know. It comes from the 10th century. That for me, it was a fascinating idea how in Ferdowsi's book also was epic poems and tales of people who fought, the heroes who fought their nation and were able to give their lives and sacrifice for nation. And I took ideas from the book and even the illustrations and the paintings of the Book of Kings and literally painted it on the body of the villains. These three people, for example, the villains represented the people of power, if the previous crowd represented the people who were really fighting the power. And so, as you can see, similar to the woman of Allah, very simple, minimal body gestures was to represent the kind of position and the power of the people that I was portraying. For me, this idea of connecting the past and the present, the poetry of the Ferdowsi to the contemporary situation was of an interest. Then I have been spending a lot of time in Egypt as I'm preparing a film. I actually created a whole new body of work in Egypt. It was shots of the people who were older, who was, for me, the closing of the chapter of the Book of Kings, which was the people whose children, whose people who have seen a lot of loss. To me, this group of people convey the feeling of loss that came after the previous sense of euphoria that came with the revolutions and the Green Movement in Iran and all over the Arab Spring. So I actually set up shop in Tahrir Square near Tahrir, and I brought people from the streets and I photographed them. I asked them to share with me an experience of loss and despair, personal tragedy or national tragedy, and I was able to photograph them, and eventually all the calligraphy is done on their faces. As I mentioned before, my photographs are highly posed and controlled emotions. For the very first time, I felt that I had to let go of the emotions. So these images are, for me, the very first time, not only I photograph real people, not models, but able to let the emotions reveal themselves. And these are, again, the people of Egypt, just as of this year that I photographed, and they're very new photographs. So, as I said, my photographs always become about human portraits, but also human portraits that captures a part of history of the Middle East, whether Iran and now in Egypt. I must say, living in exile in Iran and not being able to travel to Iran, Egypt and Middle East has become a second home. And slowly, as my distance from Iran is continuing, I'm branching off to other cultures, which I will get into as I get closer to my most recent film. Now I want to say to you about my development from still photography into film. As you know, that I think that I made photographs from 1993 to 1997. I felt a certain frustration as I became a kind of a prisoner of my own work, every day using my own hand, doing the calligraphy. And I felt that it became too much of a commodity, too much of an object. And I felt the desire to be able now to tell a story. So literally, these are the photographs that began to move. And the subjects continued, but with the moving picture, I also found an ability to be more poetic, less directly political, to be able to get out of the studio into the world and be able to collaborate with musicians, with cinematographers, to create work that puts you as the audience not in front of only an object, but to literally be able to be given an experience. In the case of Turbulent that you saw, was you were sitting in between the male and female singer. So you were literally a participant of the piece. And to emphasize that the piece was obviously about the absence of the rights of the woman to sing in the Iranian society. So I, again, stylistically exaggerated. I had the man sing. I'm not sure some of you may know the wonderful music of Shahram Nazeri, poetry of Rumi. He is a man of a conformist that sang to his audience, and he's allowed to sing. Yet, when he came to the turn of the woman, she broke all the rules of traditional music and sang a music that sort of basically it's guttural, it's without language, and it's obvious. For me, this woman became far more victorious. And I think this for me was an abstract, conceptual way to make a commentary about the way in which I felt about the position of the woman in the Iranian society. But I want to say with this piece was my first major video, was an entry into moving away from making object and creating concepts, but really truly becoming a storyteller. Also, I became very ambitious. I got out of the studio. If I could not work in Iran, I moved to work in Morocco and other Middle Eastern countries. This film called Rapture, and again, I want you to keep in mind some of the things I mentioned earlier, some of the ideas that resembles the ideas of the classic Islamic art, the forms, the geometry, the symmetry, the repetition, the black and white, the abstraction, all of this, I think in this piece particularly come through. Rapture was continuing the footsteps of Turbulent, the question of gender in relation to the Islamic societies, but this time women in relation to nature and men in relation to culture. For the first time, I felt that I was now a dance choreographer. I was creating this double channel projection where a group of women in black veil were on one side, a group of men in white shirt on the other. And for me, this was a tremendous opening in a possibility of being able to tell a story without the language, with music, and every single image became a photograph, except it was moving and it was telling a story. It was a tremendous experience for me to be able to go to Morocco and collaborate with the local people who actually acted in this film. Rapture was a beginning of my collaboration with a team of Iranian people also living in diaspora that we have continued to work so far. And the music was composed by Susan Dahim that you had just heard her sing previously. Slowly, my fascination with the moving picture developed, and slowly from this very enigmatic abstract video pieces, I became more and more narrative. And now I wanted to tell this story, gender issues related to the masculine and feminine, but about the issue of the problematic, this extreme taboos around the notion of temptation and desire for opposite sex. I am not talking too much in detail about each piece, but I would just mention this piece was inspired by the story of Yusuf and Zuleikha, and we created this fictional sort of space that resembled something between a mosque and a theatrical space, where a man who somehow resembled the mullah, but he could be also a theatrical man, gave a speech about the story of Yusuf and Zulaykha. And this was exactly when a man and woman had just encountered each other and had some chemistry. So it was a very abstract, again, conceptual, stylized approach to approaching this idea, how the notion of desire and temptation is highly tabooed and eradicated from the public space in most Islamic countries. Following on, I made another piece now shot in Turkey, being the nomad. I moved from Morocco to Turkey. This piece, Soliloquy, which was partially shot in Mardin in Turkey and in the United States, dealt with another form of opposites, but this time not about the masculine and feminine, but Western culture versus Eastern culture. I went after fantastic Islamic architecture and Western architecture in a way that they represented the ideology, the principal values of each culture. I myself played the role. I was simultaneously present in the West and in the East. There were two projections in two opposite walls. And what, if I had to say a thread of the story, was that basically the woman never felt quite comfortable either in the East or the West. If the West was very individualistic and capitalistic, the East felt very suffocating and traditional and religious. So then I moved to I've made many work since I started, because I didn't even start making work until I was 32, so I had to catch up for the last while. So being the nomad, now I made a film in Mexico. This film, it's very interesting. Intuitively, I seem to be embracing metaphors, ideas that are a principal part, again, of the Persian and Islamic literature and art. Here is the concept of the garden being really significant within our mystical tradition of literature, and also in the Quran, the tree of Tuba, which is a tree of paradise that most of you are aware of, and it's commonly known as a feminine symbol. So I created this piece that was created immediately after the September 11th, called Tuba in Mexico, where we inserted a woman inside of a tree of Tuba, surrounded by this wall, and a group of women, men and women, aimlessly well dressed in black, ran toward it. And then we had two figures that clearly represented people of power. This piece was a kind of an allegorical piece about this relationship between the sacred, what is sacred, the people, and the people of power. And eventually, when the people arrived at the garden, the female figure in the tree disappeared. The sacred, the wonderful spirit had disappeared. Again, it was a poetic response that I had to the event of September 11 that I witnessed in New York. Finally, in 2002, after having made so many photographs and videos, I became yet more ambitious. I decided to abandon art pretty much altogether. The idea of making photographs that were hung in museums and galleries, the idea of participating in one international exhibition, another, the idea that the work that I had made was not accessible to the average common people that I was photographing, the people of Iran who had no access to these museums or galleries or internet. So I decided that I would push beyond the walls of galleries and museums and enter the realm of filmmaking, making a film that could have distribution, and making a film that could be disseminated within the mass culture. Now, what happened is that I had no previous education in cinema, but I spent 6 years. We made this film based on a book by a wonderful Iranian author, Shahnoush Parsipur, who is also living in exile. She is the one out of the 5 foremost significant writers of Iran who spent 5 years in prison. And I took her book and readapted it into this film. It's important to point out that film is magic realism, just like my own work has a footing in exploring emotional, mystical, magical issues that are utterly timeless and universal, and yet it takes place in 1953 in Iran, when we experienced a coup that was organized by the American CIA in collaboration with the British government. So it was of my interest to make this film because, again, in one hand, I could explore the plight of 4 women as they reached for an idea of freedom, independence, as I explored the country of Iran that almost became the 5th female character, that it too was looking for an idea of freedom and democracy. So I started with this book in a conceptual way, but I made a film that eventually won the best film or best director Silver Lion at the Venice International Film Festival in 2009. It gave me a great gratitude, even artistically, to have taken such a risk, but professionally to see my work finally was being seen in the Iranian community. In fact, if I have any notoriety in Iran today, is not because of my artwork, but because of this film that was able to be distributed through piracy, and people like my own family were able to see it. And also it paid tribute to this wonderful writer, but also it covered a fundamental, significant, pivotal part of Iranian history, which is the 1953, that most of us think that was the groundwork for the Islamic Revolution. So as I'm speaking, you see how I've traveled from a work that covered the Islamic Revolution through the Women of Allah of 1979, the portraits that covered the 2009, and now I see myself having made a film that covers 1953. So this has not been a strategic move on my part, but it's somehow a tendency, the activist in me, that feels it's important to return to history, that history tends to repeat itself, actually. To mention the few characters that were significant, this was a woman in her 50s that had an inspiration at her age to start life over again. And again, just like Tuba, the core of the story is about an orchard. It's a magical orchard that becomes a kind of a sanctuary, a place of safety, a place of security for those women who were one way or another were running away from their difficult lives. Once they arrived in this garden, was like the Garden of Eden. No logic of the external world applied. Everything was completely ephemeral. There was no walls. There was, the time stopped. The sound stopped. The woman had an ability to create a utopian society that was somehow free of the outside world. So that 4 women actually move in here and live together. So my film, in one hand, explores this space that is extremely sacred and mystical and heavenly, but punitive if the woman made an error and committed a sin. And yet I would go back and forth to the city of Tehran, where history was being unraveled. So not very different than my approach to my photography or to video, where I continue to balance, again, the very stylized, the very mystical, emotional, feminine subjects with hardcore political and historical issues that I think are significant, but are really at odds. Again, being the Persian and the Islamic, that seems to be running in the core of who I am, that I cannot escape one or the other. So Farrokh Laga is this character who comes and buys this orchard to turn it into a salon, which eventually becomes invaded by the military. Another character, which is a magical character, is Munes, who has an aspiration to become a political activist, but her family won't allow her, so she commits suicide, and only through death she's resurrected and she's able to participate in the social political process and demand social justice. And these are some of the images that we created in the city of Casablanca. We recreated the coup in Casablanca. This is the 3rd character, Faize, who is a woman who is traditional, is middle class, is religious, but is raped. And as she comes to this orchard, she looks for a resolution. She looks for a way to sort of cope with her moral dilemma. And finally, we have a prostitute that basically, with the pain and the extreme sense of shame, she begins to go mad and begins to see her customers headless, and she escapes to the garden to die. And in fact, she is resurrected, but she is one of the most saintly characters of the film. Many people compare her character with Mary Magdalene because we actually had the gardener in the garden that actually takes care of her. So these are some of the provocative images from the film. This is a film that you could rent and you can buy, but as you can see, frame by frame, every image is highly stylized. It's created like a tableau, and even though it's trying to tell an important political, cultural story, it's still from the angle of an artist, and many of them are very, very painterly. We created all of these sets in Morocco that resembled the Iranian spaces. These are some of the scenes of the film that actually are the coup, but as you can see, are not realistic. They're also quite stylized. I would like to now briefly make you travel to my latest work. Ever since last 3 years, I have been spending a lot of time in Egypt. Some of you know that for some of us who cannot even visit Iran or work in Iran, I am not a person that could actually work in the West or find subjects that are very provocative or interesting to me. But for the last 3 years, I have found a love affair with the subject and the life and the legend of Kulthum, who is perhaps the most significant artist of the 20th century belonging to the Muslim world. She was born in 1900 and lived until 1975. Similar to the Woman Without Men, I felt this film would be an opportunity that through exploring the life and art of a woman artist, we could explore the modern history of Egypt. The struggle of the rise of fundamentalism, the journey from monarchy to the social revolution of Nasser, the notion of colonialism, because she, as many of you know, was very actively involved with all sorts of regimes, and that at the end, aside from the fact that her music moved millions and millions of people in the Middle East, and today she sells more records than any contemporary artist, she was a national icon. And for me, it also goes back to the Western gaze, that so often we are looked at as somehow inferior to the Western culture. It gives me a great pleasure to show that in that period we had an artist that in fact transcended even the expectation of the Western culture, in the way that a woman, when she died as Kulthum, 4 million people went to Tahrir Square for her funeral. That she was loved by the men, by women, by the secular, non-secular, by the elite, intellectuals, and the working class. And I just would show you some of the last 3 years, I've done extensive research, several visits to Egypt to be able to interview and speak to the people who know her, her family. And right now we are finishing our script. What you see is my storyboard, and this is how it develops. And it is my biggest challenge as an Iranian artist to direct a major feature film biography of an artist, and I am not able to speak Arabic. And so this has been pretty much my occupation for the last 3 years. And in my studio, in a single day then, I am moving from this film to my photography to making video. I would like to, this goes again from the beginning of her life to the end. I would like to end this with a 3-minute clip of a mood book that I have created about the film that we would like to make about Kulthum, which is think I'm end of my presentation.
I think,
and I apologize again for being nervous. I don't normally get so nervous, but so many smart people in this room. I feel like artists shouldn't speak, they should just make art.
well, I think I speak for all of us when I just say, wow. That was fabulous. That was terrific. Shirin has very generously agreed to answer any questions if anyone in the audience has questions. Yes. And you'll have to speak loudly, and perhaps if you stood up, then do we have, we do have a microphone. Hold on a second. Has technology failed us? I think we've come to a grinding halt after a... Okay, yes, here's one. Well, one of them worked.
Yeah, this does work. The question is, should we look at your work as a Muslim artist or as an Iranian artist who is expressing what she feels happened as a result of the Islamic revolution in Iran? And the other part is a bit more philosophical, is if we reversed the roles and said that the West was Islamic and the East was Christian, and the revolution in Iran was, let's say, Christian or of another religion, would your work be the same or would it be different?
If the Western gaze was different, then?
No, the question is, if the revolution in Iran was, let's say, Christian instead of Muslim, would your work be different?
If there was no Islamic revolution?
Yes, if the revolution was from a different major religion.
Well, first of all, you should look at my work as an artist, not Islamic artist or non-Islamic artist, Iranian or not. And may I confess that I don't think I would have been an artist had it not been for my life circumstances. I abandoned art altogether as I didn't feel like I wanted to participate as I live in the United States in this art world as we know it. And so my return to art was truly, truly a way to reconnect to my lost tradition. And you must know that I was 17 when I was in the United States, where my family went back, and I didn't see them for 12 years. So it was an extreme amount of pain and emotions as someone at a young age that felt totally abandoned by the love and distance that I had. So I understand today, for example, the sense of melancholy and all of those issues, and that's why I insist that if you take that aspect out of the work, for example, the women of the film are me. They're always outcast, they're lonely, they're rebellious, they never fit in, or the narratives are always about gardens. Gardens are a place of exile. Every work I do is about women going a place to take refuge. That's me. So, yet I'm not interested in making work that is autobiographical. But what I'm trying to say to you is that this is where life and art meet so closely, where, for example, in the West, an artist can choose whether they want to be a political artist or not a political artist. For us as artists born not only in Islamic countries, but problematic, troubled Islamic countries, oppressed countries, such as in Iran, it's a very different situation. If you're in exile, you cannot return, and you're forever taken away that right to your home. And if you're in Iran, you're in prison, you're arrested, they give you censorship. So I think the Islamic Revolution has defined my generation, because I was born before it and it happened, so I know what is like the past and what is now the present, and I don't have either or. And so my work it's a consequence of this history. And I don't want to just talk about me, because my work is not just about me. As I said, this is about a profound identity crisis that all Iranian people live every day. Are we Persians? Are we Muslims? Are we people of poetry? Are we the people of fanaticism? Are we creating nuclear bombs, or are we making art? And this is why I was saying earlier that you cannot compare the Iranian plight of Iranian artists with Egyptian artists, Turkish artists. We are in this very particular. This was a long way of answering your question, but I hope I answered it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful. I wanted to ask you, how do you explain your projects to the many people who participate, from the people you photographed in Tahrir Square to the Mexican people who participated in your film? How do you explain to them what you would like them to do and what the project means to you?
I'm so glad you asked that, because in many people's eyes, my work is so stylized, and it's such a controlled emotions, and you wonder, is she treating the people like statues, or do they really have a heart? I mean, does she really go inside? And I noticed with my portrait photography, they're all about composed emotions. This time, when I went to Egypt, it was this extreme sense of despair, loss, with all of us after the euphoria of the Arab Spring and the Green Movement and the sudden sabotage. And I wanted to go back and to close the chapter of the Book of Kings to capture that feeling of loss and defeat. But there was a human side to it. I knew that it would be older people I wanted to photograph, because so much of the younger people, the beautiful youth of Arab and Iranian societies were on the streets, on the papers, but I wanted to see the faces of the family who mourned. But on top of that, I have a photographer I work with who's American. He photographs for me. I directed. He lost a 21-year-old daughter just before we went to Egypt, and he was in the state of mourning. And I decided that we have to bring these people together, Egyptians, poor, not poor, Larry Barnes was American, myself. And we brought these people one by one. We brought them from the streets, extremely poor people, hardworking. And I guess coming from cinema, I have now some experience working with actors or people. And I said to them that we're here because we're all feeling an incredible sense of pain, loss. He has just lost his daughter. I come from Iran, and I have my own feeling of pain. I would wonder if you could share with me some personal or national sense of loss that you have had, that you could not speak about, but show in your face. And before I know, every one of them began to cry. And then Larry cried, and then I cried. It was the only time that I allowed myself to almost cut right here and let the emotion be flown and let it unravel. And it's the first time I really worked in my photograph with people. And it was the most amazing experience I've ever had. because these were real people. This was not just about making art. And I want to also emphasize something I didn't say before. I am an artist, but there is a part of me who is an activist, who for a long time, I was ashamed of being called that. But I deeply care about the people. I care about people whose lives are not in their own control. And so it's very important for me, and particularly with filmmaking, it allows me to be in the middle of it, that I don't sit in some studio in New York fabricating fictions about people that I have no contact. This is why I'm working with film, because it really, truly, the work with Kulthum's project has brought me to the villages, to the people, and etc. So there's a human side of our work that it's not just produced in studios in New York, which is very important to me. Ali, is I...
Shirin, thank you. Shirin, thank you for that wonderful talk. I love your work for many reasons, but among other things, I mean, just like you, I came here when I was 17. Just like you, the revolution happened, I couldn't go back. Just like you, I actually graduated at 83 from Berkeley, too. So we're almost we're exactly same age. We were at Berkeley same time. I left Iran right before the revolution. And I love your work for many reasons that are, I think, does speak to all of us, Iranians and so on. I'm going to ask you a tough question, though, and that it involves the politics of veiling. Because I perfectly understand the oppressive function of veil in places like Iran. And your work certainly, does a great job of contextualizing that. And I particularly like the film in the sense that the voice is silenced and so on. But what happens when you go to places like Turkey or Morocco, where veil is optional and is not imposed by the government? Don't you think that as an artist, in portraying, bringing the veil, because I was wondering why in like the Turkey context in Morocco, veil also became important as a trope in your art, because I fear, not you as an artist intending so, but in the way it's sort of received in the West, in a way it sort of perpetuates the stereotype of Islamic societies, and in a way it does exactly the kind of thing that you don't want it to do, as you pointed out, that there is no such thing as all Islamic art. It's not one monolithic Islamic world, but plurality of Muslim. Why did you insist on, the question is, why did you insist on veiling, the trope of veiling in contexts such as Turkey or Morocco?
Well, I'm very surprised by your question. Because, first of all, I believe the veil is a choice. I'm not supporting it or criticizing it. It's never been my interest to either validate it or criticize it. How could you make work about the Islamic Revolution and not have the woman behind the veil? I mean, naturally, that series was about religion. It was about religious women. It was about a history of Iran where women forced to wear the veil. And when you talk about the video work, why did I put the veil on Moroccan women? Because that work was not about Moroccan women. That work was not about Morocco. It was about Iran. And so it almost, you sound like a Westerner in a way that, I'm sorry, I hope I don't offend, but in the sense that, yeah, I mean, you could look at the veil as almost, like a traditional piece of clothing. It's folkloric. It's not always a heavy-handed symbol. The veil is what women wear, and what they choose or not choose. Of course, country to country, there are different degrees of the way that is. But for me, that is not, of course, I'm a stylized artist. I take something and I run with it. I stylize it, I exaggerate it. But what I think you're trying to aim at, as if I was trying to use the veil as a way of sensationalizing, exoticizing a subject. Because many Iranian people think that. But in reality, I didn't. I did that because that's what the women were at the time. In The Woman Without Men, many of the women didn't wear the veil. In the Book of Kings, I didn't even put on the veil on the woman. So I guess my answer is it always goes back to the principle of the series, what I'm doing, whether the woman, it's relevant, you know. But it's not a strategy. It's not that I'm trying to, you know, I hate to say this, every Western media, that's the first thing they ask me, what do you think about the veil? And I say, is there anything more important to ask? But I hope I answered your question.
If we could have just one last question, and then I think we're, no pressing questions, one more.
Well, do we arm wrestle over?
Okay. I did recognize the speaker here. So
thank you so much for your talk, for taking us through the journey of your work. I don't know that I can articulate my question as well as you were able to articulate the passage from the photography with the poetry laid on top of the image, and you spoke about embodying, I think, I don't want to misquote you, but and somehow embodying the poetry itself, or maybe I'm projecting this. So I guess my question is, how has your use of poetry changed between the early images when the poetry is actually in some ways veiling or a translucent veil on top of the subject, and the subject being yourself, into your most recent work, which it seems like is a very physical embodiment, where Kulthum, you know, is famous for singing all of these classical Arabic poets. And how do you think that the image and the poetry work together to tell either a historical or a more universal story? I guess that's my question.
It's an excellent question. The role of literature, whether poetry or novels, have been significant in my work. I started Women of Allah with poetry of Furul Farrokhzad, a number of contemporary writers. Later, I also used some of the women who wrote, like Tahireh Safarzadeh, who was a very strong believer of the Islamic Revolution, and inscribed it. Later, with the Woman Without Men, I used the novel of Shahnoush Parsipur. And the case of the Book of Kings, I thought it was an ironic thing to return to Ferdowsi, whose tales were about pre-Islamic conquest, the atrocities, the heroes who love their nation and self-sacrifice, and yet they're constantly beheaded and killed. And to me, there was an irony about the face of Iranian people, Persians now, you know, dealing with this dictatorship in a way that their atrocity is beyond explanation. So I took not his words, but his images and his approach. It was a very conceptual way. With music, it's interesting because if the literature that I inscribed on the photograph became a kind of a voice, the emotional suggestion of an emotional and intellectual voice of the woman, with the music, the poetry bring the film alive, and it added and neutralized the political dimension, and added, I mean, often I use the Attar, I have Rumi, the one that you just listened to, music of Kulthum. So is to again re-emphasize the culture of, I could say, all Islamic cultures for a change. I could generalize this paradoxical, this intersection between the more mystical, more spiritual encounters with deeply troubling political realities. And to me, all of my work, and inspired by the literature that I find, embody that form of dichotomy. Always the beauty is intersected with something terribly dark, terribly horrifying. To me, this is Islamic art of today, where you didn't perhaps have that in other centuries. So my feeling is, in Iranian society, our literature, our writers have done the best job, better than anyone else I know from the creative imagination, that have put that into focus, that profound pain of people who are living at the time, that they belong on one hand to a culture so beautiful and so rich of mystics and poets, and yet so devastatingly, deeply embedded in violence, atrocity, oppression, hopelessly so. And so this is why I make my references from the writers who can express it better than me. I am better with the visuals, but not so good with words. That's exactly why I'm not so good with words tonight. I think I did a terrible job explaining my work. But if we're talking about contradictions, opposites, that's me. I am a very strong, tough woman, but I'm also very fragile and vulnerable. On that note, I thank you all for being here and really listening to my...
I want to...
Flanked by his two wives, notice?
It was just fabulous. Well, I think we can all say what a great pleasure and honor it has been to have you and start us off on this symposium. I invite all of you who have tickets to go. We have dinner both on this side of the, you can exit from this side and on that side. I also have another to remind you that tomorrow we are not going to be here, but we're going to start in the morning at the Palazzo Steri at 9 o'clock sharp American time at the university. And so we will continue, but I have to say, I think we should all, another hand for what a rousing start we had.